be opening up in your Bibles to Genesis, the 11th chapter. Genesis chapter 11. We're going to start at the beginning of that verse, or beginning of that chapter here in just a second. I need to check something real quick. Okay, I also need everybody else to do something else after you mark Genesis chapter 11, and that is open your songbooks to number 557 and mark that, because somebody, I don't know who it was, forgot to plug in the charger on the laptop. So this thing is going to die in about 8 or 9 minutes. So just so you know, we'll not have that for the invitation song. So after you open up to Genesis chapter 11, go ahead and open up to number 557 and mark that, and we'll be singing that the old-fashioned way here in about 3 or 4 hours, whatever it is that I eventually finish. While you're turning to both of those, allow me just a brief moment to say how much I appreciate the presence of everybody that's here. I was gone last week, as most of you were aware. Don't worry, I heard a fantastic sermon on Facebook last week on gossip. So I know that everything went smoothly. Joe had told me that he was going to talk about gossip about a month ago, and we talked about it. I told some other people about the sermon on gossip. They told some other people. Somehow by the time it got through, it was something about the gospel. I don't know why it got switched. I don't know how that worked out. But I appreciate Joe. I heard the lesson and did a fantastic job. I didn't get to hear Jerry or Nick's class. I heard both of those men did fantastic as well, so I'm trusting y'all on that. But everything apparently went smooth, and so I'm appreciative of all three of those men for stepping in while we were gone. Me and Cooper went fantastic, at least in my opinion. I thought it went great. You may ask them for a different opinion, but it's a good church with a lot of great people. Just a lot of good work being done there by the men there and also by the women. I don't want to leave them out. But a lot of good things happening in that congregation. Very friendly and very fun week to be a part of. Genesis chapter 11, starting in verse 1, if you would, in just a second. Genesis chapter 11, starting in verse 1. It says, "Now the whole earth used the same language and the same words. And it came about that as they journeyed east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, 'Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly.' And they used brick for stone, they used tar for mortar, and they said, 'Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven. And let us make for ourselves a name, otherwise we'll be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth.' Verse 5, the Lord came to sound to see the city, the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, Behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they began to do. And now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them." Verse 6 is a great lesson, by the way, on unity. So that's a little bit of a side point. I know it's an overall bad story, but verse 6, I think, stands out as a great lesson on unity. Verse 7, "Come, let us go down there and confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech. And the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore," verse 9, "its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth." The story of the Tower of Babel here in Genesis, the 11th chapter, to me has always stuck out as a little bit weird. Because you don't ever see the Tower of Babel really mentioned elsewhere in Scripture, at least to my knowledge. You don't see it referenced anywhere else. You don't see it really talked about as an object lesson. And so when you're reading in Genesis, and you get through the first 10 chapters, half of which is about the creation of man, the other half is about kind of these genealogies that come into play. When you jump to chapter 11, the first 9 verses talk about these people that get together, and they just decide to build this tower for whatever reason. And so they build this tower, they get pretty high up into the sky, and there's all these artistic renditions of what this tower could have looked like. But they get pretty high up in the sky, and then God looks down on it and says, "I'm going to disrupt this, and I'm going to scatter them all over the face of the earth. I'm going to confuse their language, and they're just going to go everywhere." And so the story ends kind of on a negative note. It's kind of a commentary on man that they would even attempt something like this in the first place. But when you really think about the story of the Tower of Babel, beyond the idea of what it meant and how God viewed it and all those different types of things, the question really boils down to, why did they build that tower in the first place? What was the point of this tower? People have equated it to some kind of spiral structure that reaches up into heaven. Other people, since it's in Babel and it would be later the location of the nation of Babylon, some people have equated it with a ziggurat, where you kind of have the square-shaped structure. So the question becomes, why did they even build this in the first place? If you look at other religious faiths, and not just talking about denominationalism, but if you look at other religious faiths, such as Islam, if you look at the Midrash, which is kind of the commentary on most of the Jewish texts, you see people have their own opinions. Islam, for whatever reason, has a tradition that states that Pharaoh was the one that asked him to build it, and I quote, so that he could go up to heaven and confront the God of Moses. Now keep in mind, Moses hadn't even been on this earth yet. But this is what Islamic tradition states about the Tower of Babel. The Midrash claims that the generation was the generation of secession, saying, God has no right to choose the upper world for himself and to leave the lower world to us. Therefore, we will build us a tower with an idol on the top, holding a sword, so that it may appear as if intended to war with God. The Midrash is the Jewish commentary on these Old Testament texts, and so according to Jewish tradition, they looked upon it very unfavorably. That's kind of the vibe you get from Genesis chapter 11, those first 9 verses. Wasn't really something that God liked. But the Jewish tradition states that these people built this tower with a sword approaching God, saying, we're now going to war with you, because after all, you have the heavens, we have the earth, and there's an incompatibility here. Both of those, I think, are wrong on several levels. I don't think either of them really speak to the real nature of it. When you look at Genesis, the 11th chapter, and you look at what the text actually reveals for us, especially here in verse 4, you get a sense of what the whole purpose of the Tower of Babel was, kind of in a nutshell. Here in verse 4 it says, come, let us build for ourselves a tower or a city, and a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name. So if you're asking yourself the question of why they even built this tower in the first place, by the way, the whole one-handed thing is kind of throwing me off. If you're asking yourself the question of how did or why did they even build this tower in the first place, you kind of find a clue here in verse 11. Because you see that the motivation for them building this was, we want to build for ourselves a name that will obviously reach out over the whole earth. People will be able to see it from miles away. Later, whenever they invent rocket ships, they'll be able to see it from the skies. So we want to establish ourselves as being a nation or a city of some kind of prominence. And it points back to the real reason, or the real kind of condemnatory attitude of all of them, really points back to the idea of pride. These people had it within themselves that they wanted to make a name for themselves. They weren't satisfied with the fact that God had just obliterated the world in Genesis chapter 6, and they are alive now on the other side of that. That wasn't enough for them. They wanted to have some kind of stature. They wanted to have some kind of fame. They wanted to have some kind of notoriety. You see a similar attitude here in 1 Timothy chapter 6. Flip over there if you would. 1 Timothy chapter 6, you see another similar attitude that these people had kind of here, albeit a little bit different category. 1 Timothy chapter 6, as Paul is winding down this first of 2 epistles that he would eventually write to the young evangelist. And he's warning him of various things that will pop up in Timothy's lifetime. And I think, obviously, still things that pop up in our lifetime as well. 1 Timothy chapter 6, starting in verse 3, it says, and Paul warns Timothy of this, saying, if anyone advocates a different doctrine and does not agree with sound words, and you kind of have shades of Galatians 1, 6 through 9 in that sense, those of our Lord Jesus Christ, with the doctrine conforming to godliness, if he doesn't agree with those or preaches something different than that, verse 4, he is conceited and understands nothing, but has a morbid interest in controversial questions, disputes about words, out of which arise envy, strife, abuse of language, evil suspicions, and constant friction between a depraved mind and deprived of the truth, who suppose that godliness is a means of gain. He doesn't pull any punches as he describes this. Verse 6, godliness actually is a means of great gain, when it's accompanied by contentment. For we have brought nothing into the world, so we cannot take anything out of it either. If we have food and covering, verse 8, with these we shall be content. But those who want to get rich fall into temptation, a snare, many foolish and harmful desires, which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some by longing for it have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves through with many griefs. If you read both or all of this entire section here in 1 Timothy chapter 6, you start in verse 3 and you go throughout verse 10, what you notice is, at least on a cursory reading, is that he seems to be talking about 2 different subjects. He seems to, in the first half of this, to be talking about false teachers. These are people who are of depraved mind, who understand nothing, they're just kind of speaking to genealogies, and they just love kind of causing friction. You look at the second half of this section, and now he's talking about people who, for whatever reason, have taken upon themselves to just try to get every dollar and every penny that the world owns. They're incredibly greedy, they're incredibly covetous. And so he seems to, in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 3 through 10, to be talking about 2 different groups of people. But when you look at the way he connects the 2, and that's really what he mentions there, especially in verses 6 and 7, the way that he connects the 2 is not as 2 individual groups, but as one causing the other one. He mentions these false teachers who are depraved of mind, who are deprived of the truth, who are only obsessed with genealogies, their own notoriety, and their own attention. He says that these people suppose that godliness is a means of gain. In other words, I'm going to be a Christian, or I'm going to pretend to be a Christian at least, because I think that it'll give me some notoriety in this world. I think that it'll give me a leg up. I think that it'll give me some kind of standing. And so I'm going to attempt to be a Christian because I want to gain something for myself. This is where you see the rise, by the way, of these televangelists. People who say, you too can be a Christian if only you make 3 easy payments of $99,000, and you make them biannually, make them every year for the rest of your life, you too can be a Christian.
You also see it on a much more subdued level when people attempt to try and become elders in the congregation. You may think this is a weird story. I've actually seen it with my own 2 eyes, and it's not here in case you turn around and look at Paul and Shell. But people that try to become elders of the congregation because they think it'll give them some kind of standing in a business sense. I knew of one person who told me point blank that he said becoming an elder was the best thing for his career. Why? Because now he could put it on his resume. And he could display some kind of management over a group of people rather than just kind of being another one of the regular guys. And I don't mean that in a condescending way. But people try to think that maybe being a Christian will give me some kind of leg up in the world because I can attain something else. And what Paul points out here in 1 Timothy chapter 6 is godliness is actually means of great gain, if you partner it with contentment. And that's the key phrase when you look at this. When you look at Philippians chapter 4, which is going to be kind of our text for the rest of the morning, look over at Philippians chapter 4. You kind of see this attitude a little bit talked about in Philippians chapter 4. You think about these people here in 1 Timothy chapter 6, you look at the people there in Genesis chapter 11, you see these people kind of in a nutshell. They're all about pride. They're all about me. They're all about what I can attain as an individual. And Paul, if anybody, had every right in the world to talk about what he is worth, what he has attained, and what he has done. But notice Paul's language here in Philippians chapter 4, starting in verse 8. He says, finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things. And the things you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. Paul sets himself up as an object lesson immediately after he says, if there's anything good, if there's anything whole, pure, focus on those types of things. And then whatever you see of me, of those types of things, focus on those things also, because that's really what being a Christian is all about. He doubles down on it more in a personal sense, starting here in verse 10, when he says, but I rejoiced in the Lord greatly, that now at least you have revived your concern for me. Now he's talking about the partnership that they have in the gospel. Indeed, you were concerned before, but you lacked opportunity. And here's the verse we want to focus on. Verse 11, not that I speak from want, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. That's a powerful statement as it comes from the pen of the Apostle Paul, because basically what he's telling these people is, I have learned no matter what, in every situation, to be content. Some people will say, well, he's gone through a whole lot of bad things, he's had a lot of bad tragedies happen in his life. And so some people will say, if anybody had a right to complain or had a right to be upset, it would have been Paul. And Paul also, coming from a very privileged Jewish family, having sat at the feet of Gamaliel, he understood the other half of it as well. And yet he says here in Philippians chapter 4, verse 11, I know that the money came, I know that you will help me support me in the gospel, and you did your part in furthering the borders of God's kingdom. But whether the money came or whether the money didn't come, I have learned, in whatever situation it is, to be content. Doesn't matter if I prosper, doesn't matter if I'm poor. I've learned how to be content. And that's really the verse that we want to focus on. When you look at Philippians chapter 4 and verse 11, this verse, kind of in a nutshell, has this idea of contentment just reading all through that. Because Paul speaks at something that I think all of us in today's world really need to focus on. I don't know about you, but all of us as Americans kind of have this mentality where we always want more. We want to attain more, we want to do more, we want to grow more, we want to have more. But when you look at Paul's definition, or when you look at Paul's mindset here in Philippians the 4th chapter, verse 11, he says, I have learned in whatever circumstances I am to be content. I want to break that verse down into 3 distinct sections. The first point that he brings out is, I have learned. This is something that he's gained over a period of time. This isn't something that he just was born with. And I think some people feel that way. When you look at somebody who's just very happy and who's very even-keeled, it's very easy to look at that person and say, well, that guy was just born that way. That's just his disposition. You know, Travis Christian just kind of takes everything as it is, and he always seems very happy. He never has a frown for anybody. That's just kind of the way he is. I mean that very, whatever the complimentary of him. Complimentary, that's the word I'm looking for. I mean that very complimentary of Travis. Because we look at somebody like him, we look at somebody like Nick, and that's just the people on this side, the only two, that we can look at and we say to ourselves, well, those are just good people. They're just happy people. They're just very content people. But I'm not built like that. I'm a type A personality who wants to be at the top of everything. I have to have this, I have to be the best, I have to be everything to everybody. We look at that and we think, well, that's not a bad thing, is it? In some circumstances it is. And what Paul mentions here, especially in this first half of this verse, is it's not something that just came naturally for him. When you look at Paul's personality, and scientists and psychologists have diagnosed Paul's personality, when you look at his gospel, or when you look at his epistles, when you look at his actions, he is a very type A, driven leader. And this is the type of character that he has. And so when he says here in Philippians chapter 4, verse 11, that this is something I've learned, it probably isn't something that came easy to him. Look with me, if you would, in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Paul uses a lot of sarcasm in the things that he has to say to a lot of churches. And you can tell by the end of the second letter of the church of Corinth, now he's really starting to amp up the sarcasm. Because the argument that was made, especially in the first letter to the Corinthians, is, well, you're not an apostle, you're just kind of doing all these things, and so you don't really have the authority here. And so Paul in the second chapter of 2 Corinthians really starts to amp up the sarcasm, really starts to say things that go right between the eyes. When you look at 2 Corinthians chapter 11, starting in verse 16, look at how he compares himself to the next person. He says, "Again I say, let no one think me foolish, but if you do, receive me even as foolish, so that I also may boast a little. What I'm saying, I'm not saying as the Lord would, but as in foolishness, in this confidence of boasting." Notice the sarcasm. Notice the humor that he uses. Verse 18, "Since many boast according to the flesh, I'm going to boast also. For you, being so wise, tolerate the foolish gladly. For you tolerate it if anyone enslaves you, anyone devours you, anyone takes advantage of you, anyone exalts himself, anyone hits you in the face. To my shame, I must say that we have been weak by comparison. But in whatever respect as bold, I speak in foolishness, I am just as bold myself." Paul sets himself up as kind of this contrasting figure to these people who would come in and say, you can't live like Paul says, you have to live like this, you have to live like this, you have to live like this. They set themselves up as teachers. And Paul says that they're going to boast about all the things that they had done, I'm going to boast also. But look at the things that he boasts in. Here, starting in verse 22. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Now here's where he switches gears. Are they servants of Christ? Verse 23. I speak as if insane, for I'm more so. In far more labors, in far more imprisonments, beaten times without number, often in danger of death. 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I've spent in the deep. I have been on frequent journeys and dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness. And you think he's going to stop there. We get the point, Paul. Look at how he continues. Dangers on the sea, dangers among false brethren. I've been in labor, I've been in hardship, through many sleepless nights. In hunger and in thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. Apart from such external things, and this is, I love this verse, how he puts this in. There's the daily pressure on me of concern for all the churches. Verse 29. Who is weak without my being weak? Who is led into sin without my intense concerns? Paul sets him up as this contrasting figure that he has with these other Judaizing teachers, or the Judaizing teachers, saying these people are claiming to be somebody. But if they're going to claim all these different little things as attributes or as compliments to their character, then I'm going to claim these things. And then he lists just a litany of all the things that he had endured in his lifetime. And you can't read that list, anybody, then, now, whatever, without being completely overwhelmed with all the things that he had sacrificed. This is somebody who came from a very well-to-do Jewish family, and now he's literally spent a night and a day in the deep. He's been beaten without count half the time. He's been in danger from robbers. He's been in all these different things. Let me ask you something. What do you think Paul learned in that circumstance? Paul's obviously using this to help further the gospel. These are all dangers that he incurred while he's preaching the gospel, whether from the people that are persecuting him or in travels or whatever. What do you think he learned in that entire scenario? He probably learned at least one of the 12,000 things that he could have learned. That God's going to protect him through that. And God's going to be with him through that. And kind of mirroring what he would say in an earlier chapter of the book of 2 Corinthians, when I am made weak, then God is made strong. Paul learned in a lot of different circumstances, whether it was a sense of prosperity or in a sense of disparity, he has learned to be content. Something that we learn over time. It's more of an experiential nature. I want you to look at Hebrews, the 5th chapter. Hebrews chapter 5. Hebrews chapter 5 is a great chapter that describes kind of the story of Melchizedek, at least a little bit in a nutshell. And in Hebrews chapter 5, he now talks about Jesus. He kind of compares the two, and there's a lot of comparisons between Melchizedek and Jesus, but in verse 7 he flips it to talking about Jesus. And talking about Jesus in verse 7, he says in Hebrews chapter 5, in the days of his flesh he offered up both prayers and supplications, with loud crying and tears to the one able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his piety. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. And having been made perfect, he became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation. Verse 10, being designated by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. What you read there in Hebrews the 5th chapter, starting in verse 8, is it says very simply that Jesus learned obedience from the things that he suffered. Here's a question for you. How did Jesus learn those things? Because if you just look at it kind of on the surface, what it seems to imply is that Jesus didn't have the intelligence to know what it was, or to know about the sufferings. Or he didn't know what obedience was all about. And so the implication there in Hebrews chapter 5 is that he learned obedience by the things that he suffered. He didn't know what obedience was, now he knows, because he went through them. Is that really what the Hebrew writer is getting at? Is the Hebrew writer implying that Jesus just didn't have intellectual knowledge of what something was? No, what the Hebrew writer is driving at, what he would build on in chapter 6 and in chapter 7, and pretty much capstone it in chapter 12 is, Jesus went through those things, and now he has experiential knowledge of what it's like to go through those. He is our perfect high priest, not because he understands it intellectually, but because he understands it intimately. He knows what obedience means in every circumstance. And because he knows, as an example for us, we can look to him as our perfect high priest. When Paul says here in Philippians the 4th chapter, verse 11, that he's learning something, it's not to say that he didn't have intellectual knowledge of what it is. What he's saying is, I went through these things firsthand, and I have experiential knowledge of what it's like to go through all these things. And my faith has gotten deeper as a result. The second half, or the second part of Philippians chapter 4, verse 11, is he says there that phrase, I have learned in any circumstance I am to be content. If you look at Philippians, the 4th chapter, and look at how he immediately finishes off that phrase. Look in Philippians chapter 4. If you look at how he immediately finishes off that phrase, he gives a little bit of context on that statement. Philippians chapter 4, starting in verse 12. Paul writes, verse 11. Not that I speak from want, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. That's the phrase that we're focusing on. Verse 12, I know how to get along with humble means. I also know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and of suffering need. What Paul says there in Philippians chapter 4, verse 12 is, I have learned in every situation to be content. Now, the first impression of that is, well, obviously, if somebody's rich, if somebody's just loaded financially, then obviously they know what contentment is. Because contentment is nothing more than being satisfied with the things you have. And so if you have a lot of things, you're obviously going to be satisfied in that. But what Paul mentions, curiously enough, here in Philippians the 4th chapter, verse 12 is, I know how to be abound, I know how to abound, and I know how to be abased. I know how to live in prosperity, and I know how to live in depravity. The depravity is the easy part. Those of us who have gone through some tough times, and anybody who's gone through college probably knows what lean times are, at least superficially. And there's people who know depravity and poverty on a lot deeper level than that. I'm just kind of giving my impression of it. There was a time in my life where my food budget was $10 a week. I had a lot of nasty hot dogs that week. But when you look at that time period in your life, you learn how to get by in that time period. And so it's easy for us to say, well, I understand what it means in depravity to learn how to be content. You learn how to put up with those nasty hot dogs. You learn how to make ramen noodles just awesome because you put things in that you think are healthy but really don't. They shoot your blood pressure through the roof. You learn how to be content with those things. But what about the other half? Philippians chapter 4, verse 12, he says, I know how to live in prosperity, which is a weird statement to us. But when you look at 1 Timothy chapter 6 and go verses 3 through 10, you don't have to look back there if you want to. But in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 3 through 10, what Paul mentions there, the real crime of these people, is not that they were rich. That's not the problem. The real crime of those people was that they desired to be rich. In other words, if they had $5, they wanted 50. Now I understand there's nothing wrong with wanting a little bit more money. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a covetousness mentality. But those who have $5 want 50, and somebody who has $100 wants 500. Or on the flip side of that, somebody who has $5 million, which is more money than I'll ever see probably, but somebody who has $5 million, they want $50 million. Or somebody who has $500 million wants $1 billion. I watch a lot of Shark Tank, and probably all of you who have heard me talk about it know this intimately. I watch it with the Holmes. We don't watch it together, but we talk about it every once in a while. But Shark Tank is fantastic. What you see there is, on 5 Shark panel, you have 2 people that are billionaires. You have, I can't remember their name right now because I'm totally blank. I'm still coming off hydrocodone 2 weeks later, so maybe that's why I'm losing. You have Mark Cuban, and then you have the angry guy, the bald dude. And so both those guys are billionaires. Kevin O'Leary, thank you, whoever said it. Kevin O'Leary's the other guy. Both those are billionaires. And then you have the other 3 guys that are simply millionaires. Kevin O'Leary, Mark Cuban, both worth over $3 to $5 billion. And then you have the other 3 guys that are just worth, I don't know, somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 to $400 million. $400 million is enough to live an entire city comfortably for the rest of their lives. But all you hear from these people over and over and over again is, I got to be that guy. I'm not there until I'm a billion. And you know what it will eventually be? It'll be a trillion. Talking about this covetousness mentality where all we want is more, 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 more. And in the sense of poverty, it's very easy to identify what contentment looks like. It's, I have 3 potatoes, and I have 2 hot dogs, and with these I shall be content. For God will supply everything else that I need. No matter what it is, He'll take care of me. On the flip side of prosperity, it's the attitude of no matter what I have, God is still all I need. And you can be poor, and you can be rich, and you can both still be greedy. And it's the lack of contentment that he addresses in both of these instances. Look in Ecclesiastes, the 5th chapter, for it. Ecclesiastes chapter 5. I love to reference Ecclesiastes at times like this because of what it speaks perfectly to is the nature of contentment. If you look at Ecclesiastes and read all 12 chapters, what Ecclesiastes is from cover to cover is this experiment on how to attain nirvana or how to experience immortality through means outside of God. In other words, I'm going to get all the stuff that I can and try to find all the happiness that I can in this world, and maybe I'll have satisfaction and happiness apart from God. That's what the experiment more or less is. But in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, at various points, he comes upon the realization that it's not enough. In Ecclesiastes 5, starting in verse 13, that's one of those. Because he says here in Ecclesiastes 5, starting in verse 13, there is a grievous evil which I have seen under the sun. Riches being hoarded by their owner to his hurt, which seems counterintuitive. Because when those riches were lost through a bad investment, and he had fathered a son, then there was nothing to support him. As he had come naked from his mother's womb, so will he return as he came. He will take nothing from the fruit of his labor that he can carry in his hand. That's the whole, you never see a U-Haul behind a funeral. Once again with the hydrocodone. A hearse, thank you. Verse 16. This also is a grievous evil. Exactly as a man is born, thus will he die. So what is the advantage for him who toils for the wind? Throughout his life he also eats in darkness with great vexation, sickness, and anger. Here is what I've seen to be good and fitting. To eat, to drink, to enjoy oneself in all one's labor, in which he toils under the sun during the few years of his life, which God has given him. For this is his reward. Furthermore, as for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth, he also has empowered him to eat from them. And to receive his reward, rejoice in his labor, for this is the gift of God. Verse 20. For he will not often consider the years of his life, because God keeps him occupied with the gladness of heart. If you were to nail down or ask yourself the question, what is the meaning of life? He answers it in chapter 12. He says, fear God and keep his commandments. But if you want to ask the question, how to attain maximum satisfaction in this life, apart from obedience to God, which is obviously a part of it, but how to attain maximum satisfaction in this life through obedience to him, it's through being happy with the things that God has blessed you with. The wife of your youth, the possessions that you have, those types of things, those are the things that truly matter, at least in this world, to give your contentment. People that are rich, people that are poor, both of them can find that type of contentment. There's an interesting story I heard the other day that I thought was fitting for this type of lesson. The story about a fisherman who's out fishing, and he's just every day he's out there fishing nonstop. And then apart from him, or one day, a wealthy fisherman walks by. This wealthy fisherman's walking on the beach, begins to watch him a little bit. And so he walks up to this fisherman, notes that every day he's out there trying to get fish, trying to feed his family. He says to him, after he sees him taking like a 3 or 4 hour siesta in the middle of the day, he says, why don't you go out there and work again? You're taking the afternoon off. Why don't you go out there and fish some more? He says, well, I've caught enough fish for today. And he says, well, if you work in the afternoon, you can catch more fish. And he says, well, what's the point in that? Well, you can take those fish, you can take them to the market, you can sell them. Well, what's the point in that? Well, you can buy more boats. Okay, well, what do I do with that? Well, you take those boats, you employ more people, and then you catch more fish. And then what do I do with those fish? Well, you sell those, you buy more boats. After you acquire so many boats, then you can catch a whole lot of fish. He says, well, what's the point of that? Well, then you can take the afternoon off. That's what I'm doing right now. Why do I need to do all that in order to do what I'm doing right now? Sometimes, for whatever reason, we're so caught up in the rat race of trying to acquire so many things to live the exact same manner that we are right now. And that's what people, as Colossians chapter 3, verse 5 calls covetousness. Those are the things that people that are covetous, those are the things that they don't understand. So when Paul says here in Philippians, the 4th chapter, verse 11, I have learned in whatever state I am to be content, he not only means in depravity, you can see that in 2 Corinthians 11. But you can also see in the fact that no matter what he has, whether it's a lot or whether it's a little, he is always going to be content through all things. Then we get to the definition of contentment. The last section of this verse says, I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. What does contentment mean? Contentment means very simply, the technical definition, as being in a state of peaceful happiness. That's what Webster calls contentment, the state of peaceful happiness. And as I look at Travis and I look at Nick, I see that, a state of peaceful happiness. Spiritually, what it means is peaceful obedience to God. It means no matter whether I'm abased, whether I'm bound, whatever situation I am going to be content towards my God. In 1 Corinthians, the 12th chapter, he talks about this a little bit in regards to spiritual gifts. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, starting verse 12. All three of these chapters, chapter 12, 13, 14, speak to the idea of spiritual gifts. But 1 Corinthians 12 specifically talks about the differences in gifts. And one of the main arguments and one of the main controversies in this church was, well, this guy has this spiritual gift, I wish I had that gift. And somebody else would say, well, that guy has that spiritual gift, I would love to have that gift. I don't want to be this gift, I want to have that gift. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, starting in verse 12, Paul speaks to this mentality, saying in verse 12, for even as the body is one, and yet has many members, all the members of the body, though there are many, are one body, so also is Christ. For by one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, whether slaves or free, and we were all made to drink of one Spirit. For the body is not one member, but many. If the foot says, because I'm not a hand, I'm not a part of the body, is it not for this reason any the less a part of the body? And if the ear says, verse 16, because I'm not an eye, I'm not a part of the body, it is not for this reason any the less a part of the body. Verse 17, if the whole body were an eye, where would the hearing be? And if the whole were hearing, where would the sense of smell be? They're great questions. But now, verse 18, God has placed the members, each one of them, in the body just as he desired. What Paul puts forth here in 1 Corinthians, the 12th chapter, is a very simple truth. And that is, there are going to be people who say, I want to have this talent, and I want to have that talent. I don't want the talent I have right now. And even though this is speaking about spiritual gifts, you can still see the same mentality in the world today. I wish I could evangelize like that guy. I wish I could lead singing like that guy. Or I wish that I would be an elder for these reasons. I wish that I could fulfill these roles. I don't want to be myself. I want to be that guy. I would love to be Ken Hale. You see that attitude prevailing here in 1 Corinthians, the 12th chapter. And the argument that Paul makes in verses 12 up through verse 17 is, every little person has their place. No matter if you're a hand, no matter if you're an eye, no matter if you're an ear, every person has their place. And that's the overall theme. But did you look at verse 18? Because that verse 18 is really the linchpin in this entire situation. Talking about hands, talking about ears, talking about eyes. What he says there in verse 18 is, God has set the members, each one of them, in the body just as he pleased. Think about this thought for just a second. Whatever you are as an individual, and I don't mean what clothes you wear, I don't mean your car, none of that. What I'm talking about is whatever you are as a person, your likes, your dislikes, your integrity, your obedience to God, whatever it is that makes you you, the good aspects. God has designed those, and he has created you to be you, and it pleased him to do that. So in other words, if you're a person that is not very good at song leading, but you're great at interpersonal relationships, that makes God happy. I'm trying not to be Joel Osteen here. But if you're a person that is not good at evangelizing or public speaking or song leading, but you're great at being with people through tough times, then that's the role that God looked at you and said, that's perfect for you. That makes me happy that you're fulfilling that role. Can you develop the other talents? Sure. But the emphasis is not on developing other talents here. The emphasis is not on knocking the ones that you do have. And somebody will say, well, I don't want to be a good song leader because I want to be that guy. If you're a song leader and you're a good song leader, we have plenty here in this building right now, then you make the most of that. No matter what it is that you are in this building, no matter what it is that you are in this church, you make the most of that. And don't sit there and look at somebody across the aisle and say, I wish blank about my life. Develop that if you want. But not at the expense of the thing that you can really, really help this church with. It's always been interesting to me if you look at a lot of people in the world, especially those people who are millionaires, people who are rock stars, it always seems like, for whatever reason, the rock stars, after a period of time, start to retire. They think to themselves, I don't want to go on tour, I don't want to have platinum selling albums all the time, I don't want the millions. And for whatever reason, they think to themselves, I'm just going to stop doing that. When for 99% of anybody who ever picks up a guitar, all they want to do is to be a rock star. And after a period of time, they just don't want that anymore. What does that tell me about that lifestyle as we're talking about contentment? What that tells me about that lifestyle is there's something about that may fulfill them to a certain extent, but it doesn't give them the satisfaction and the contentment that they really are craving in this world. There's somebody who said simply one time ago, there's a God-shaped void in everybody's life. And as much as you try to jam other things within there, the only thing that will fill that hole is God. And so some of us who say, well, I want to be this because if I'm this, then everything will be okay. If I'm that, then everything will be okay. It's just not true. Because as Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 13 points out, the only thing that truly matters in this world, the only thing that will give you satisfaction is fearing Him and keeping His commandments. Not being the best song leader. If you're the best song leader, be the best song leader. Not being the best evangelizer. If you're the best evangelizer, be the best evangelizer. But serving Him, fearing Him, keeping His commandments. That's where the emphasis is. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5, he calls covetousness idolatry because in our quest to gain more things, we ignore God and focus on that. And after a period of time, that becomes our God. When in reality, we could search for that for 20, 30, 40 years and use all sorts of rationale for it. Just climbing to the top of my corporate ladder, whatever it is that we want. But in reality, at the end of that journey, the thing that we understand is that has effectively replaced God. And that's why he calls covetousness in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5 as idolatry. You may be sitting here this morning, you may be content with your life. You may be thinking to yourself, I come to services, I read my Bible every day, and all these things, and that's great. But there may be an aspect of your life that's not great, that God is not happy with. And if that's the case, and you need public support this morning, I would encourage you to come down, sit next to Jerry, and let us help you with those things. You may be sitting here thinking to yourself, I'm not content with my life because I know all these things I need to do, and baptism is at the top of that list. We can help you with that too. And if there's anything that we can aid you with, I encourage you to come as we stand.